Chapter
Act
1. Ordinary World. The fluorescents hummed overhead, spilling too much light into a room that had no business being so bright at this hour. The lab smelled like burnt coffee and antiseptic, the kind of scent that clung to your clothes like a bad decision. Amelia Crow sat at her workstation, her fingers drumming out a thoughtless rhythm against the metal countertop, while her other hand scrolled through genetic readouts. She'd been at this for hours. DNA sequencing, gene mapping, comparative analysis. The work never stopped, and neither did she. She liked it that way. Research didn't leave much room for second-guessing. It didn't ask questions about why she hadn't been on a date in 2 years, or why her phone only lit up with email notifications and automated reminders. It didn't wonder if she was lonely. Her eyes flicked to the time glowing in the corner of her monitor. 2:43 a.m. Nothing new, just another night spent chasing patterns and theories instead of sleep. The lab was empty, silent except for the occasional beep from a processing machine and the tap-tap-tap of her keyboard. The only problem with silence was that it made her think, and thinking led to doubts. She sat back, rolling the tension from her neck. She should leave, get some rest, but the moment she powered down her computer and walked out of here, she'd just go home to her studio apartment, microwave something that barely passed as food, and stare at the ceiling until she talked herself into working again. So she stayed. A new batch of samples had come in that afternoon, Project Lupus, straight from some no-name lab in the middle of nowhere. It was hush-hush, flagged for expedited testing, the kind of thing that usually meant funding was involved. She ran through the sequencing data, eyes scanning for anything unusual, and then she saw it. A blip, a deviation, a tiny, insignificant anomaly in the genetic markers. She frowned. That's not right. It was small, too small for most to notice, but she wasn't most. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, isolating the oddity, magnifying it. A 0.5% variance in base pair alignment. Not much, just enough to be wrong. She rubbed at the tight spot between her brows. Could be an error in processing, could be contamination, could be nothing. She should run it again, double-check, cross-researcher, make sure. But it was late, and the rational part of her brain, the part that had spent years grinding through academia, said she was just overworked, seeing ghosts in her data. She logged the anomaly, marked it for review. Then she closed the file. She shut down the terminal, pushed away from her desk, and stretched. The lab felt bigger at night, the walls pressing in with the weight of too much thinking and too little sleep. She grabbed her coat, slung it over one arm. On her way out, she hesitated, glancing back at the screen, now dark and silent. A feeling crawled up her spine, a whisper of unease. Something about that anomaly didn't sit right. She ignored it. Just numbers, just data, just another night in the lab. The university hallway was empty, save for the click of Amelia Crow's boots against the tile floor. It was past midnight, and the fluorescents had that washed-out yellow tinge that made everything look a little sick, a little off. She pulled her coat tighter around her, but it wasn't the cold getting to her. It was something else. She stepped out into the night. The air was crisp, clean in a way the lab never was, but she barely noticed. Her mind was still back there, tangled up in genetic sequences and base pairs. Always thinking, always working. She'd meant to go home hours ago, but one thing led to another, a misaligned data set, a misplaced decimal, a sample that didn't quite behave the way it should. And suddenly, the clock was dragging her past another midnight. That was the way of it. It always was. She walked across the quiet campus, hands jammed into her pockets, her bag slung over one shoulder. The place looked different at night. Empty, lonely. Maybe it wasn't the university. Maybe it was just her. Her phone sat heavy in her pocket. No notifications, no missed calls, no texts from friends asking where she'd disappeared to, because she hadn't disappeared. She was exactly where she always was, a year ago, hell, maybe 2. She might have had dinner plans, a drink after work, someone to go home to, but somewhere along the way, the research had become everything. She hadn't meant for it to happen, hadn't made a decision to stop living, but the late nights had stacked up, then the long weekends, and then suddenly, this was all there was. Her career was moving forward, sure. She was publishing, making strides in genetic research, carving out her place in the field, but at what cost? She should be proud, she was proud. But sometimes, late at night, when the lab was silent and the work was done, she felt it. The gap. She stopped at the curb, waiting for the light to change. The city hummed around her, neon signs flickering, cabs rolling by with their backseats full of people heading home, heading somewhere. She thought about the anomaly in her data, the strange little thing that shouldn't have been there. Maybe she should have double-checked it. Maybe she should have flagged it for urgent review. But that wasn't what she was thinking about, not really. She was thinking about how long it had been since she'd looked up from her work and realized she was alone. Amelia Crow's apartment was small, clean, and empty. It had all the warmth of a waiting room, the kind of place people passed through rather than lived in. The lights were dim, the air smelled like stale coffee and the faint chemical trace of her lab coat, and the silence was the kind that settled into the corners and stayed there. She tossed her bag onto the tiny table near the kitchenette, shrugged off her coat, and ran a hand through her hair. The clock on the microwave blinked 1:07 a.m. in pale green digits, accusing her of another late night. She pulled a takeout container from the fridge and peeled back the lid. Something vaguely resembling pasta, probably from 2 nights ago, maybe 3. It didn't matter. It was food, and it wouldn't kill her. She slid it into the microwave and hit the buttons with a practiced indifference. The machine hummed to life, filling the room with a low mechanical drone. Her phone sat face down on the counter. She flipped it over, checked it. Nothing. No missed calls, no messages, no emails that weren't from the university or some automated funding board. She put the phone down and leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Her mother had called a week ago, or was it 2? "You're burning out, Amelia." The words had been the same, but the tone had changed over the years. It used to be sharp, urgent, a push toward something different. Now it was resigned, like she'd accepted that her daughter was never going to slow down. She didn't need to slow down. She was fine. The microwave beeped. She grabbed the container, took a plastic fork from the drawer, and carried it to the couch. The TV was there, but she didn't turn it on. The bookshelves were lined with reference materials. Genetics, microbiology, the occasional dusty philosophy book she swore she'd get to one day. One book was already open on the coffee table, its pages yellowed at the edges. An old journal, borrowed from her mentor's collection. She wasn't sure why she'd brought it home. She wasn't even sure why she'd started flipping through it at the lab earlier that week, but there was something about the way Professor Woodward had handed it to her, his expression unreadable. You want to understand what you're working on, you need to see the history. She hadn't expected history to look like this. The journal was filled with old accounts of things that shouldn't exist. Creatures that walked like men, but weren't men at all. Mentions of transformation, heightened senses, instincts that ran deeper than blood. Fairy tales, that's what it was. The kind of thing people whispered about when the lights went out. She hadn't meant to read it, but when she did, she hadn't been able to stop. And when she reached a section detailing early genetic studies, primitive, incomplete, but unsettling in their familiarity, something cold and sharp had settled in her gut. She had told herself it was nonsense, old myths dressed up in pseudoscience. And yet, when she had seen that anomaly in her data tonight, that tiny blip in the otherwise perfect sequence, this book was the first thing that had come to mind. She shut it, pushed it away. Fantasy. She picked up her fork and took a bite of her now rubbery pasta, chewing mechanically. Outside, the city hummed. The distant wail of a siren, the occasional car passing, the world moving on without her. Inside there was just her. The book, the silence, and the whisper of a feeling she couldn't quite shake. The centrifuge whirred, a steady, mechanical purr that filled the lab like white noise. Amelia Crow stood at the counter, arms crossed, eyes narrowed at the test tube spinning inside. The label on the side read, Project Lupus, a name that felt like an inside joke she wasn't in on. She had run plenty of DNA samples in her career. Human, animal, hybridized cell cultures from research studies looking to bridge genetic divides. The process had become as routine as brewing coffee. Put in the sample, let the machines do their job, analyze the data, find nothing surprising, and move on. But this one wasn't behaving. The machine beeped, signaling the sequence was ready. Amelia pulled up the results on her monitor and frowned. This didn't make sense. She rechecked the dataset, ran the numbers again. The screen glowed in front of her, spilling an eerie blue light across the otherwise dark lab. Rows of genetic code scrolled past her eyes, neatly ordered, precise. And yet, something about the sequence wasn't right. She leaned in. The human genome followed a predictable pattern, a familiar blueprint she had spent years studying. But this wasn't human. It wasn't entirely animal either. The base pairs, where they should have been standard, locked in by biology, shifted in ways she'd never seen before, as if something had been rewritten. Okay, she murmured, grabbing a pen, tapping it against the desk. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. She flipped through comparative reference data, pulling up sequences from primates, wolves, known hybrid mutations. None of them matched. Her stomach tightened. This was new. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She should flag it for further review, run deeper analysis, contact Woodward, someone with clearance to look at this with her. But she didn't move, because beneath the logical, methodical part of her brain, the part that had spent a decade in academia dismissing myths and folklore as the stuff of unscientific minds, something stirred, something she didn't want to name. She reached for the journal on the far end of her desk, the one she'd pushed away the night before, the one she wasn't supposed to be thinking about. She flipped through brittle pages, past centuries-old accounts of creatures that walked the line between man and beast, past scribbled notes on heightened strength, accelerated healing, something ancient and untamed, woven into their very DNA. Fairy tales. That's what she had told herself. But the screen in front of her was saying something else. The air in the lab felt heavier, the world smaller. She swallowed hard. Jesus. This wasn't a data error. And if it wasn't a data error, then she wasn't just looking at an anomaly. She was looking at proof. University board meeting. The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and old paper, the kind of place where ideas went to die under the weight of bureaucracy. Amelia Crow sat in the middle of it, hands folded tight, eyes sharp, watching the board members file in one by one. They moved like men who'd seen too many grants disappear, too many researchers chase ghosts instead of results. The overhead lights buzzed. Someone shuffled a stack of papers. Professor Woodward wasn't here. Not anymore. He would have backed her, but his time had passed. Now it was just her against the suits. Dr. Peterson, the head of the research committee, cleared his throat. He was an old-school academic, the kind that thought tenure was a God-given right. His eyes settled on her like a man already preparing to dismiss what she had to say. "All right, Dr. Crow," he said, tapping his pen against the desk. "You requested this meeting. What exactly are we looking at?" Amelia reached for the remote and clicked the projector to life. The genetic sequence she'd spent the last 48 hours analyzing lit up the screen in clean, clinical rows of A's, T's, C's, and G's. "This," she said, keeping her voice steady, is a DNA sample pulled from an undisclosed subject in a remote sector. It was submitted under the research tag Project Lupus. That got a couple of raised eyebrows. Peterson leaned back in his chair. Someone else shifted uncomfortably. What you're seeing isn't just an anomaly. It's something entirely new. The genetic markers indicate heightened regenerative properties, resistance to disease, and, most notably, a non-human evolutionary structure embedded into an otherwise human sequence. A long pause stretched out across the table. Then Dr. Felding, a biochemist with a thick mustache and the personality of a rusted door hinge, exhaled through his nose. "You're telling us this isn't human?" "I'm telling you that it shouldn't be." Another beat of silence. Dr. Langley, the youngest on the committee, leaned forward, tapping a manicured nail against the table. "What kind of subject are we talking about here?" Amelia hesitated. She knew what she wanted to say. She also knew how it would sound. She clicked to the next slide, showing a side-by-side comparison of a wolf's genetic sequence and the sample she'd analyzed. "The mutations are mammalian in nature," she said carefully. "Specifically, canine." That did it. Peterson scoffed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "For God's sake, Crow, don't tell me you're standing here pitching us werewolves." "I'm pitching you genetic data." He let out a low chuckle, like she was a kid in a lab coat who'd brought Bigfoot tracks in for analysis. Langley, though, didn't laugh. She studied the screen, brows drawn together. "If this data is correct, what are the implications?" "The implications," Amelia said, pulse kicking up a notch, "are that we're looking at a biological structure unlike anything we've ever encountered, something capable of advanced healing, strength, endurance. If we can isolate the genome responsible for these enhancements, we could be looking at breakthroughs in medicine, regenerative therapy, immunology." Felding grunted. "And if this is an error?" "Run it yourself," Amelia shot back. "Take the sample, sequence it, see if you get a different result." More silence. Then Peterson let out a sigh, tapping his pen against the table again. "Fine, let's say, for the sake of argument, that what you're showing us is real. Where did this come from?" "Undisclosed location," she said. "I don't have the clearance yet." Peterson leaned back, expression unreadable. "And what exactly do you want from us?" Amelia took a breath. Here it was, the moment she'd either get approval to chase this, or she'd be laughed out of the room. "I need to go to the source," she said. "Whoever submitted the sample, whatever they found, I need to see it for myself." More glances, more skepticism. Langley finally spoke. "We'll fund it, but there are conditions." Of course there were. "You take this trip, you document everything, and you bring back something publishable." Peterson nodded. "You have 1 month. If this turns out to be nothing?" "It won't," Amelia said. She had no idea if that was true, but in her gut, she knew something was waiting for her, and she was going to find it. The boardroom was empty now. The stale smell of burnt coffee and old leather chairs lingered, a leftover reminder of the battle that had just taken place. Amelia Crow sat at the long table, fingers resting lightly on the stack of printouts in front of her. The projector screen was dark now, but she could still see the ghost of her genetic sequences in her mind, burned into her thoughts like a cigarette stain on cheap fabric. The skeptics had left their doubts behind, but she'd seen it. The glint in Langley's eye, the slight shift in Peterson's tone. They didn't want to believe, but the data had spoken. Something was out there, and now, for the first time in a long time, someone was willing to let her chase it. She leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly, fingers drumming against the armrest. 1 month. That's what they'd given her. 30 days to find something tangible, something that could either cement her career or send her spiraling into the ranks of crackpot scientists who chased myths instead of funding. She didn't believe in myths, but the data didn't lie. Her eyes drifted to the manila envelope she'd shoved into her bag before the meeting. Woodward's letter. She pulled it out, unfolded the thick paper. The handwriting slanted and familiar. The ink was dark, bold, written with the kind of force only a man like Woodward could put into words. Amelia, there are things in this world that science can't yet explain. Don't make the mistake of assuming they aren't real. Follow the truth, even if it takes you places you never expected to go. She read it twice, then again. A month ago, she would have laughed at this, would have rolled her eyes and muttered something about Woodward getting sentimental in his old age. But now she wasn't sure what she believed. She let the paper slip between her fingers and exhaled, slow and steady. The rational part of her, the scientist, the woman who had clawed her way through academia with logic and proof, told her that she needed to be careful, that this could ruin her. But the other part of her, the one she rarely acknowledged, the one that had stirred when she first saw that anomaly in the DNA, was thrumming with something new. Excitement. For the first time in years, the work didn't feel routine. It didn't feel like another grant proposal, another research paper, another endless chase towards something she was supposed to care about but never really did. This felt different. She folded the letter carefully, tucking it back into the envelope. Then she stood, straightened her coat, and grabbed her bag. The board wanted proof. Fine. She'd give them proof. She just wasn't sure they were ready for what she was about to find. Chapter 2. Meeting the Mentor. The university hallway smelled like old books and bad coffee, the kind of place where ambition went to die under too many years of fluorescent light. Amelia Crow walked down the corridor, her bag slung over one shoulder, her mind still tangled up in DNA sequences and Woodward's letter. She should have felt good about the board's decision. She'd won. They were giving her funding, a chance to chase something that didn't fit neatly into a research paper. But doubt sat in her gut like a swallowed stone. As she passed the faculty lounge, she heard it, the unmistakable hum of her name. A pause in conversation, the slight shift in tone when someone thought you weren't listening. She stopped just outside the door, leaning against the frame. "She's actually going through with it?" a voice drawled, half amused, half exasperated. Evolutionary biologist, professional skeptic, and self-appointed guardian of what counted as real science. "She gave a whole presentation," someone else chimed in, claimed the DNA was some kind of hybrid anomaly. I snort. "I mean, next thing you know, she'll be telling us vampires are real too." Soft laughter rippled through the room. Amelia's jaw tightened. Croy was always sharp, Mayfield said, the kind of backhanded compliment that people in academia like to pretend wasn't an insult. But even the best lose their way. Chasing myths isn't a career move, it's an obituary. The words hit harder than they should have. She shouldn't care. She knew how this world worked. The moment you colored outside the lines, they started sharpening their knives, waiting for you to trip. And yet, what if they were right? What if this was stupid? What if she really was throwing away everything she'd worked for over some wild theory that would turn out to be nothing? A tightness curled in her chest, something ugly and uncertain. Then Mayfield chuckled, voice dropping into something smug. She's got a month before she crawls back, admits she was wrong, and begs for another shot at real research. Something in Amelia snapped. She pushed open the door. Hard. The room went quiet. Mayfield turned, coffee cup halfway to his lips, his expression frozen somewhere between surprise and amusement. Dr. Crow. "Mayfield." She walked inside, slow, deliberate, dropping her bag on the nearest table. "I hear you've been taking an interest in my work." The others shifted uncomfortably, but Mayfield didn't miss a beat. He leaned back against the counter, easy like a man who thought he already won. "Just academic curiosity. I have to admit, I didn't peg you as the type to chase fairy tales." Amelia smiled, all teeth. "That's because you lack imagination." Someone coughed. A chair scraped against the floor. Mayfield tilted his head, studying her like a problem he'd already solved. "So tell me, Crow, what happens when you don't find anything?" She didn't blink. "Then I don't find anything. That's how research works." He took a sip of coffee, the corner of his mouth twitching. "And if you do?" She met his gaze, steady. That was the real question, wasn't it? If she did find something, if this was real, then everything changed. Science, medicine, the way people saw the world, and her. "Then I do," she said simply. Mayfield chuckled, shaking his head. "God help us all." Amelia grabbed her bag and turned toward the door. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need them to believe her, but as she stepped into the hallway, her pulse hammering harder than she liked, she couldn't shake the doubt slithering under her skin. Because the truth was, she didn't know if she believed herself yet. The numbers didn't lie. They sat in neat, black and white rows on the screen, clinical and merciless, stripping away any illusion of security. Projected budget. Approved funding. Pending renewals. She scrolled through the grant reports, eyes scanning for something she already knew wasn't there. More money, more time. Her lab was running on fumes. Not unusual. Research wasn't cheap, and the university didn't hand out unlimited resources unless your work had a guaranteed payout. Something that would get a headline. A patent. A drug they could slap a trademark on. And this? This wasn't that. She leaned back in her chair, rubbed a hand over her face. Project Lupus was a risk. A month of field work on what could amount to nothing, a wild goose chase into the middle of nowhere with nothing but a vague lead and an old professor's cryptic letter to justify the expense. She glanced at the other open tabs on her screen, the standard grants, the safe studies. She could close the file on Project Lupus, submit a more traditional proposal, stay on course. No one would blame her. She drummed her fingers against the desk. Outside, the campus was quiet. The lab was empty, everyone gone for the night. She was used to that, being the last one here, letting the weight of silence settle in. But tonight, it felt different. Heavier. She exhaled sharply, clicked out of the budget report and shut the laptop. 1 month, that's all they had given her, and if she took it, if she walked away from everything she knew to chase this, there's no guarantee she'd have a lab to come back to. The overhead lights buzzed, throwing sharp, uneven shadows across the counters. Amelia sat in her usual spot, elbows on the desk, an old book spread open in front of her. She didn't know why she had brought it back out. The pages were fragile, the ink faded in places, but the words were clear enough. Descriptions of creatures that shouldn't exist, not legends, not campfire stories. Her mentor had given it to her, told her to keep an open mind. She turned a page, eyes flicking over phrases that should have meant nothing but didn't. Enhanced healing, strength beyond human limitations, instincts tied to cycles of the moon, a bond that defies logic, linking one soul to another. She stared at the last line, something cold twisting in her gut. She should have laughed, closed the book, tossed it back onto the shelf with the rest of the myths and superstitions. Instead, she sat there, staring, because she had seen the data, the irregularities, the way the genetic markers shifted just slightly off from anything recorded before. She pinched the bridge of her nose. I'm a scientist. Should I really be chasing legends? It was absurd, insane. And yet, the anomaly had been real. The numbers didn't lie. And if the numbers were right, if the data held, then maybe, just maybe, the stories weren't as impossible as they seemed. The air in the lab felt thick, heavy with something unsaid. She closed the book. She should walk away, but instead she sat there, fingers resting on the worn cover, and let the idea sink in. Because for the first time in a long time, the unknown didn't feel like a dead end. It felt like a door. Professor Woodward's office smelled like old paper, pipe smoke, and the faint trace of something musty, like the past itself had settled in and refused to leave. Books lined the walls, the kind of collection that had been amassed over decades. Spines cracked, pages yellowed, some thick with dust, others worn thin from constant handling. Modern journals sat in haphazard stacks on the desk, colliding with ancient tomes, the old and the new tangled together in the way only a man like Woodward could manage. Amelia stood just inside the doorway, her arms folded tight, her pulse still a little too fast from the decision she hadn't fully made yet. The overhead lamp cast long shadows, making the room feel smaller than it was. Or maybe it was just the weight of everything pressing down on her. Woodward sat in his leather chair, the deep lines on his face more pronounced in the dim light. He wasn't as sharp as he used to be. Age had a way of dulling even the brightest minds. But his eyes still held that knowing gleam, like he was already 3 steps ahead of her. He gestured to the seat across from him. "Sit, Amelia." She hesitated, then did. The chair creaked under her. He tapped the stack of papers in front of him, slow and deliberate. "I hear you found something." She let out a breath, ran a hand through her hair. "I don't know what I've found." He nodded, as if he expected that answer. Then he leaned forward, pulling a worn book from the pile and flipping it open to a marked page. "I want you to look at this." She glanced at the page, her stomach tightening. A hand-drawn sketch. Faded ink, rough lines. A figure that was neither fully man nor fully beast. Broad shoulders, sharp claws, a face caught between the two worlds. Not a monster. Not something grotesque. Just something different. The caption beneath it read, "Observed near the Carpathian Mountains, 1843. Her throat went dry. "This is a joke," she muttered. But she knew it wasn't. Woodward's lips twitched like he almost smiled. "Do I look like I'm joking?" She exhaled sharply, dragging a hand over her face. "Come on, Professor, you're talking about, what? Lycanthropy? Folklore?" She shook her head, leaned back. "I'm a scientist." "And what do scientists do?" His voice was calm, steady. She frowned. "They ask questions," he continued. "They test limits, they push beyond what's known." He tapped the book. "This was recorded nearly 200 years ago, Amelia. A respected explorer, a man of science, wrote this down. Not as fiction, but as an observation." She glanced at the sketch again. Woodward's voice dropped, softer now. "I spent years chasing this, following dead ends, dismissed by my peers, but I never had the technology to prove it." He nodded at her. "You do." A silence stretched between them. "You think I should go?" she said finally. He smiled, just a little. "I think you already know you will." She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the armrest. Because the worst part? He was right. Professor Woodward reached for the journal with a slow, deliberate hand, like it weighed more than a few ounces of brittle paper and ink. Maybe it did. Maybe it carried something heavier, something that had sat in the dark too long, waiting for someone like Amelia Crow to pick it up. He slid it across the desk. The leather cover was cracked, darkened with age and time. The pages were yellowed at the edges, some curled, some torn. It smelled like dust, like a room shut too tight for too many years. Amelia hesitated before touching it. "You recognize the insignia?" Woodward asked, nodding toward the faded imprint on the front. "A crest, maybe? Something official once, now barely legible." She ran a thumb over it, feeling the worn grooves beneath her skin. "It looks... military." "British Expedition 1861, Woodward said. His voice was quieter now, edged with something that made the hair on the back of her neck lift. A doctor, a historian, and a man whose role was never listed in any official documentation. They traveled through remote parts of Eastern Europe and beyond, following a series of strange medical cases. They never made a formal report. Amelia frowned, flipping the cover open. Why not? Woodward smiled, but it wasn't the kind that meant amusement. She skimmed the pages, eyes tracing the neat, precise handwriting. It was a log. Observations. The kind she'd seen 100 times in research documents, except the words here weren't dry statistics and medical jargon. They were unnerving. She read aloud. We encountered the first one near the ridge, its form shifting between light and shadow, a terrible beauty in its movement. It knew we watched, knew and did not fear. Even in its bestial state there was intelligence, a knowing, and when it looked at me, God help me, it was not a beast that met my eyes. The words sat between them, thick in the air. She turned the page, more notes. Mentions of regeneration, wounds that closed too fast, bodies that didn't break the way human bodies should. A few cruder sketches. A figure that stood too tall to be wolf, too broad to be man, its eyes filled with something the writer had no words for. Amelia swallowed. What happened to them? Woodward folded his hands. 2 were found dead in an abandoned village, no sign of an attacker. The 3rd was never found. She looked up at him. And you believe this? I believe they saw something. She wanted to scoff, toss the book back onto his desk, tell him that people saw what they wanted to see, that myths and science didn't mix. But she couldn't, because she'd seen the data, the sequences that shouldn't exist, the markers that defied classification. And now, looking at this journal, something in her gut twisted. Because deep down, she already knew she was going to go. The night air was cold when she stepped out of the building. She stood under the campus street lamp, flipping through the journal again. The old paper rasped against her fingers, the words staring back at her in the dim light. She should have felt ridiculous. She didn't. Instead, there was a slow burn in her chest, something curling low in her stomach, like a secret she wasn't supposed to know yet. This was bigger than she'd thought, bigger than the anomaly in the lab, bigger than a funding gamble. Woodward's words echoed in her mind. Follow the truth, even if it takes you places you never expected to go. She pulled out her phone, scrolled through her contacts, paused on Dr. Langley, one of the few from the board who hadn't scoffed at her outright. Then a voice on the other end. Dr. Crow? She tightened her grip on the journal, looking up at the night sky, exhaling slow. I'm in, she said. Set it up, I'm going. Chapter 3. Journey into the Unknown. The train rocked like a tired old beast, metal wheels groaning against the worn tracks. The countryside stretched out beyond the window, the world flattening into endless fields and hills that rolled toward the horizon. It was a long way from the glass and steel of the city, from the sterile air of the lab. Out here, everything felt older, heavier, like time itself moved slower, dragging its feet through the dirt. Amelia Crow sat alone in the compartment, her bag at her feet, the tattered journal resting on her lap. She traced a finger over its worn leather cover, mind flicking between the past and the present, between the words scrawled inside and the raw data still burned into her memory. She should have been exhausted. She wasn't. The anxiety hummed under her ribs, but so did something else. Something that had been missing for a long time. Excitement. She exhaled, pressing the tips of her fingers into her temples. This was insane. She was leaving behind her lab, her research, everything she knew, all on the word of a dead man's notes and a genetic anomaly no one could explain. And yet, deep down, she already knew this wasn't a mistake. The train slowed, the landscape shifting. The fields grew wilder, the trees thicker, taller, forming dark clusters along the tracks. The kind of place people whispered about in old stories, where the world blurred between what was real and what wasn't. The air changed. It smelled different here, heavier, filled with something she couldn't quite name. She turned her attention back to the journal, flipping it open. Her eyes traced the same passage she'd read 100 times in the last week. We have entered their territory now. The land does not belong to men. She swallowed, fingers tightening around the edge of the pages. Outside, the dense forest loomed, and somewhere in there, something was waiting. The train pulled into the station with a slow, aching groan. Not that there was much of a station to pull into, just a small, cracked platform, a rusted bench, and a station house that looked like it hadn't seen fresh paint since before she was born. Amelia stepped off, boots hitting the worn planks. The air was colder than she expected, thick with damp earth and something else. Something she could feel more than smell. The place was nearly empty, just a handful of locals, bundled in heavy coats, hunched over as they went about their business. They cast quick glances her way, then looked away just as fast. She adjusted the strap of her bag and approached the station master, an older man with deep lines carved into his face and eyes that had seen too much. "Excuse me?" she said. "I need a car out to," she checked the note in her pocket. "The North Hollow area." The man stiffened. She caught it, the slight twitch of his jaw, the way his fingers curled a little tighter around the ticket book in his hands. "North Hollow?" His voice had the rough edge of someone who smoked too much and trusted too little. She nodded. The silence stretched just a little too long. Then he let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Not much out that way," he muttered. "I know." He looked her over again, this time with something else in his gaze, not just wariness, something deeper. A warning, unspoken but clear. People didn't go to North Hollow, not unless they had a reason, and no reason was ever good. Amelia squared her shoulders. "Can I hire a car or not?" A beat, then a slow nod. "There's a man with a truck. He'll take you as far as the old mill road." He hesitated. "After that, you're on your own." She didn't flinch. She'd been on her own for a long time. She handed him the cash, took the receipt, and stepped back onto the platform. The other passengers had already drifted off, disappearing into the mist that clung to the trees. She glanced toward the edge of the station where the forest stretched out in all directions. The place didn't feel abandoned. It felt watched. She exhaled, gripping the strap of her bag. Whatever was out there, whatever had left its mark in her DNA samples, whatever the journal had tried to describe, she was getting closer, and there was no turning back now. The forest was a different kind of dark. Not the city kind, where streetlights painted long shadows and neon signs buzzed like tired sentinels. This was real dark, thick and alive, wrapping around Amelia Crow as she stepped off the dirt road and into the trees. Her boots crunched over dead leaves, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the pressing quiet. The air was dense, damp, threaded with the scent of pine and earth. Every instinct told her she shouldn't be here, which was exactly why she kept going. She adjusted the strap of her bag, her fingers brushing over the hard edge of the USB drive inside. The data was there, the DNA sequences, the evidence, the reason she was standing in the middle of nowhere, chasing something half her colleagues had laughed out of the room. She took another step, and then stopped, because she wasn't alone. The realization hit like a cold wind. The air around her had shifted, the silence stretching tight, too tight. The trees weren't just trees anymore. They were watching. She turned her head slowly, scanning the darkness. Nothing. Then, movement. A flicker between the trunks, fast and quiet. Another to the left. Shadows that weren't just shadows. And then they stepped forward. 3 of them, men, but not. Their movements were too fluid, their presence too heavy. They weren't just standing there. They were waiting, assessing. The one in the center spoke first. His voice was low, steady, a command wrapped in quiet threat. "You're trespassing." Her heart was a steady drum against her ribs. She kept her hands where they could see them. She wasn't stupid. "I'm here for research," she said, keeping her voice even. "My name is Dr. Amelia Crow." No reaction. She reached slowly into her bag, pulling out the drive. "I have genetic data that—" The man in the center stepped closer. Just one step, but it was enough to send ice along her spine. "We don't care what you have." The way he said it made it clear. They knew. Something shifted behind her. Another presence. She turned, just as a new figure stepped into the clearing. Younger. Softer, in a way the others weren't. He glanced at her, then at the man in front of her. "Hold on," he said, calm but firm. "Let's hear her out." A flicker of hesitation. The tension in the air didn't break, but it thinned, just enough. The younger one, Rowan, she'd learn later, nodded toward the drive in her hand. "You have data?" She swallowed, nodding. "Yes." "Prove it." She hesitated. Then she pulled a tablet from her bag, powered it on, and brought up the screen. The genetic code flickered to life, the blue glow illuminating their faces in the dark. Rowan exhaled sharply, eyes locked on the sequence. "I've seen this before," he murmured. Amelia tensed. "You have?" The man in the center didn't look at the screen. He looked at Rowan. Rowan met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. Then he turned back to her. "You should come with us." The cabin was smaller than she expected. Not primitive, but not exactly modern either. Wooden walls, a table pushed against one side, a single window overlooking the dark. They led her inside, closing the door behind them. The air shifted, less cold, but not warm, not safe. She stood in the center of the room, her heart still too fast, her body catching up to the fact that she had just willingly walked into something she didn't understand. Rowan leaned against the table, arms crossed. "You're not lying." It wasn't a question. Amelia shook her head. "No." The others weren't convinced. They stood near the door, watching her, still coiled, still ready. She exhaled, steadying herself. "So what now?" Rowan studied her for a long moment. Then, "Now you wait," she frowned. "For what?" He pushed off the table. "For him." And for the first time she felt it. A pull, just outside the cabin, something moving toward her. Something that felt like it had already known her before she ever stepped into these woods. The lodge smelled like smoke and pine, like the earth itself had been pulled inside and left to sit too long. The fire in the center burned low, casting sharp, restless shadows on the wooden walls. Amelia stood just inside the doorway, her hands steady at her sides, her mind running 1,000 calculations. The room was full of eyes, wolf eyes, not literally but close enough. The men and women seated around the fire weren't ordinary. She knew that the moment she stepped in. They moved differently, too quiet, too controlled, like they didn't just occupy space, but were part of it. Packed. She could feel it in the way they sat, in the way they breathed, in the way none of them looked directly at her but still watched her. Rowan was at her side, but he wasn't speaking for her. This was hers to navigate. An older man cleared his throat, his voice rough as bark. "What do you want here, Dr. Crow?" She met his gaze. No hesitation. Answers. A woman snorted. "Science thinks it can answer everything." Amelia didn't blink. That's the idea. More eyes on her now, some skeptical, some amused, some sharp as broken glass. She lifted her chin slightly. "I don't care about fairy tales. I care about facts. Your people," she gestured around the room, careful not to make it sound like an accusation, "have something I've never seen before. A biological anomaly, something that defies known genetics." "You talk about us like we're experiments," someone muttered. "No," she exhaled. "Like you're extraordinary." That got their attention. The elder who had spoken first, gray-hailed but not weak, studied her. "And what happens when you get your answers?" She hesitated. She knew the correct response. Tell them she wanted to use this knowledge for medical research, that she had no intention of exposing them. But something told her they'd know if she lied. So she told the truth. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I'm here to find out." The fire crackled. The silence stretched. Then, before anyone else could speak, the door opened, and he walked in. The shift in the room was immediate. The tension didn't drop, it shifted. Redirected. All eyes turned toward the figure stepping through the threshold. Lucian. Amelia knew it was him before anyone said his name, because of the way the space bent around him, because of the way the air got heavier, thicker, like the gravity in the room had just changed. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dark-eyed. He moved with the kind of confidence that wasn't just authority, it was ownership. Like he didn't just command respect, he was respect. His gaze flicked to her, and everything else in the room, every set of eyes, every lingering stare, became background noise. Something inside her tightened, a sharp pull like a thread drawn too taut. Recognition, except she had never seen him before in her life. Lucian stopped just short of the fire, his expression unreadable. "What is she doing here?" The elder cleared his throat. "Jima has data, evidence." Lucian's gaze didn't leave her. "Evidence of what?" Amelia forced herself to hold his stare. "That you exist." The words landed between them like a thrown knife. For a second, nothing moved. Then a flicker of something in his dark eyes, not anger, not fear, something else. Lucian studied her, slow and deliberate. "And what do you plan to do with that information, Doctor? Understand it." His head tilted slightly. "You think you can?" "Yes." "Arrogant?" "Accurate." A low chuckle from someone at the fire. The tension in the room didn't break, but it shifted again. Curiosity replacing hostility, just a little. Lucian's jaw flexed. He was still watching her, still weighing something in his mind. She should have been afraid. She wasn't. Because beneath all the unspoken threats and challenges, beneath the sheer presence of him, she felt it. That strange, impossible pull, like something in her recognized something in him. And the worst part, she could tell he felt it too. The clinic was nothing like Amelia's lab. No cold fluorescence, no polished steel counters or machines humming with precision. Just a small wooden cabin, its walls lined with dried herbs and glass jars filled with powders and tinctures. The air smelled like pine, smoke, and something faintly medicinal. Old-world medicine, before test tubes and microscopes. Rowan moved through the space like he'd been doing this forever, his hands quick but careful as he sorted through supplies. He was younger than most of the others she'd seen, but his presence was steady, controlled, the kind of man who knew how to keep people alive. Amelia stood near the table, arms crossed, watching him work. "You actually use all of this?" Rowan glanced at her, one brow raised. "What did you think we did? Shift into wolves and let nature take its course?" She gave him a flat look. "I thought you'd have more modern resources." "We do," he said, setting down a bundle of dried leaves. "Sometimes, when we can get them. But you think a werewolf can just stroll into a pharmacy for antibiotics?" "Fair point." She let her gaze sweep the room. Some of it was familiar. Bandages, antiseptics, even a small case of syringes. But most of it was different. Roots, oils, handmade salves. "You don't have a real lab," she murmured. Rowan smirked. "I make do." She hesitated. "You trust this stuff?" He leaned against the counter, arms crossed now. "Do you trust everything that comes out of a lab?" She opened her mouth, closed it. He nodded, like he already had his answer. "You rely on machines, formulas, controlled environments," he said. "We rely on what the earth gives us. What we've used for generations." He picked up a small jar, rolling it between his fingers. "Different paths, same goal." Amelia frowned. "Which is?" "To heal." That stopped her. Because for all her research, all her time in the lab running numbers and sequencing DNA, that was it, wasn't it? The whole reason she had started down this path. She wanted to fix things. She glanced at him. "You think we can learn from each other?" Rowan smiled, slow and knowing. "I think you already have." She didn't argue, because maybe, just maybe, he was right. The first whisper came over dinner. It was a quiet affair, if you didn't count the fact that half the people in the lodge could hear a heartbeat from across the room. The fire crackled, voices low but steady. They ate the way a pack should, together, with the kind of familiarity that said they'd been doing this for a long time. Amelia sat at the edge of it all, near Rowan, picking at the food on her plate. It was good, better than she expected, but her mind wasn't on the meal. It was on the people around her, the way they spoke in half sentences and understood anyway, the way a glance could say more than a conversation, the way they moved like something unseen tethered them together. She wasn't part of it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Then the tension changed. A subtle shift. The way shoulders straightened, how glances flicked toward the door. She caught a murmured phrase from across the table. "Near the border." Her grip on her fork tightened. Rowan noticed. He set his glass down. "Don't ask." She did anyway. "What's happening?" He sighed. "Trouble." Before she could press, the door swung open. A man stepped inside, breath short, scent sharp with adrenaline. He was a sentinel, one of the perimeter guards, though she hadn't learned his name yet. Lucian was on his feet before the man spoke. "They were scouting near the ridge." Silence. Not the kind that meant confusion, the kind that meant everyone already knew what this was. Lucian's expression didn't change, but something in the air did. "Just one?" he asked. The sentinel nodded. "Did we saw?" Another voice, from one of the elders at the fire. "Could be more." Lucian's jaw flexed. Amelia wasn't an idiot. She could read the room. This wasn't just some territorial dispute. This was history. Rowan pushed his plate away. "They don't come this close unless they want us to know they're there." "Who?" Amelia asked. A long pause. Then Lucian looked at her. "The Hollow Fangs." The name didn't mean much to her, but the way the room felt heavier at the mention did. "Rival pack," she guessed. Lucian's gaze didn't waver. Something like that. There was more to it. A past that hadn't settled. An old wound that hadn't scarred over. Amelia swallowed. "What happens now?" Lucian didn't answer, because he already knew. She stood outside later, beneath the stretch of a sky that didn't have city lights to wash out the stars. The fire inside still burned, voices still murmured low. The pack was strategizing, calculating, preparing. She should have felt out of place. Maybe she did. But standing there, breathing in the sharp scent of pine and earth, she realized something. She didn't want to leave. It wasn't about the research anymore, not entirely. She had come here looking for data, for evidence, something groundbreaking, something that could redefine what they knew about genetics. But she had found something else. A reality that wasn't meant for the world outside these woods. A people who lived in the space between myth and science. And more than that, a people who needed to be protected. Her fingers curled around the edges of her sleeves. If she walked away, someone else would come. Someone with fewer questions and more demands. Someone who would look at them and see something to control. She thought of Lucian, of Rowan, of the way the pack moved together like one living thing. She wasn't sure where she fit into all of this, but she knew one thing: she wasn't going to let anyone tear it apart. Chapter 4. Realization of a fated mate bond. The wooden table wasn't much of a lab bench, but Amelia made do. The equipment she had brought with her was basic, more suited for field work than a sterile research environment, but it would have to be enough. Her laptop screen cast a faint glow over the rough cabin walls, illuminating tubes of blood samples, labeled slides, and hastily scribbled notes. She adjusted the microscope, focusing in on Lucian's sample. The first time she'd run it, she thought she'd made a mistake. The second time confirmed it. She knew human DNA. She had spent years analyzing its patterns, mapping its code, breaking it down into raw data that fit neatly into reports. This didn't fit anywhere. Lucian's sequence had something else, something woven through it like another thread in the fabric, shifting in a way that wasn't supposed to be possible. But that wasn't the part that made her breath hitch. The part that made her blood run cold. The part that made her stomach drop and her fingers tighten around the edge of the table was the second slide. Her own blood sample. She had tested it against his on impulse. Something nagging at the back of her mind, something irrational. And now the result stared back at her. The same anomaly, not as strong, not as fully developed, but it was there. Something in her was connected to him. She exhaled, slow and shaky. "This isn't possible," she murmured. Except it was. The numbers didn't lie. The sequencing, the resonance. It was all there, clear as day. Their DNA wasn't just reacting to each other, it was aligning. Her pulse thudded in her ears. What does this mean for me? For him? A knock on the cabin door made her jump. She shut the laptop, her mind still reeling. Rowan's voice came through the wood. "Amelia, it's time!" She swallowed hard, pushing down the rising questions, the flood of uncertainty clawing at her ribs. Later. She would think about this later. Right now, she had a ritual to witness. The sun was dying behind the trees, bleeding gold and fire into the sky. The clearing was filled with bodies, the pack moving together in a rhythm that had nothing to do with speech and everything to do with instinct. Drums pounded in the background, slow and steady, like a heartbeat made of sound. Amelia stood at the edge of it all, hands in her pockets, watching. Lucian was there, near the center of the gathering, bare arms, loose shirt, eyes dark in the firelight. He didn't look at her, but he knew she was there. She could feel it. Rowan had explained what she was about to see. A minor rite, nothing sacred, just tradition, a reminder of who they were, of what bound them. The fire crackled, and one of the elders stepped forward. He held a small knife, its edge gleaming. One by one, the wolves approached. The elder cut their palms, just a shallow slice, a line of red against skin, then pressed their hands together, mixing blood. A bond, a vow. No word spoken, but the meaning was clear. We are one. Amelia swallowed. Her world didn't work like this. Science didn't work like this. And yet, she could feel the pull of it, the weight of something more than biology, something beyond what she could explain with facts and data. Lucian stepped forward. The elder made the cut. He didn't flinch. His gaze flicked to hers. Just for a second. Just long enough. And in that moment, watching him press his palm against another's, watching the firelight carve his silhouette into something almost mythical, she felt it. Something deep, something rooted inside her bones. She didn't understand it, but she knew, with certainty she couldn't shake. She wasn't just here to study them. She was part of this, whether she wanted to be or not. The waterfall wasn't much, just a narrow silver ribbon cutting through the rocks, feeding into a shallow pool that reflected the sliver of moon above. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. Amelia hadn't planned to come this far. After the ritual, she needed space to think, to breathe, to push down the questions clawing at her mind. But the woods had a way of leading her places, and now she was here, alone, or so she thought. "You shouldn't be out here." The voice came from the shadows, low, steady, unmistakable. "Lucian." She turned, pulse kicking up despite herself. He stood a few feet away, leaning against a tree like he had all the time in the world. He was dressed the same as before, loose shirt, dark pants, the kind of effortless presence that made him look like he belonged here, like he was carved from the forest itself. "You following me?" she asked, crossing her arms. His mouth curved, just a flicker, gone before it could mean anything. You're an outsider in the middle of a contested territory. I don't have to follow you, I just have to wait for you to walk into something you can't handle," she bristled. "I can handle myself." He stepped closer, slow and deliberate, not threatening, just sure. "You have no idea what's out here," he said, voice quieter now. Almost too quiet. "The Holofangs are watching. They know something's changed. Your presence, your research." "It's a problem." She stiffened. "I'm here to study, not start a war." "Doesn't matter," Lucian said. His eyes held hers, dark and unreadable. "They'll use you as an excuse." For a moment, the only sound was the rush of the water, the distant rustle of wind in the trees. Amelia swallowed. "So what? You want me to leave?" Lucian didn't answer right away. His gaze flickered over her face, her stance, the tension in her shoulders. Then, just barely, his jaw clenched. "You should," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. Neither of them moved. The space between them felt thin, like it had been stretched too tight, like a line drawn in the dirt, waiting to be crossed. Lucian exhaled, low and controlled, and for a split second his fingers twitched, like he'd reached for something and stopped himself at the last second. Then, as if remembering himself, he took a step back. "Go back to the cabin, Amelia." Her chest felt tight. She wanted to push, to break through whatever wall he had built between them. But pride was a hell of a thing, so she just squared her shoulders, turned, and walked away. And she felt his eyes on her the whole way back. The cabin was cold. Amelia sat at the desk, hands steady despite the storm in her head. The microscope sat in front of her, the slides lined up. Lucian's DNA. Her own. She had tested them again, and again, and again. The data was impossible. And yet it was real. She flipped through the journal Woodward had given her, the pages whispering under her fingers. Ancient records, myths dressed as history, mentions of soul-bonded pairs, wolves drawn together by something deeper than instinct, something written into their very bones. She had thought it was just legend. But the science didn't lie. Her DNA and Lucian's weren't just compatible, they were reacting to each other. Changing. She exhaled, pressing her palms into the desk. Her heart was hammering, too fast, too hard. This wasn't just science anymore, it was something else. Something older, something she couldn't control. She didn't believe in fate, but she was starting to believe fate believed in her. Ambush by the rival pack. The trees loomed taller here, their thick trunks swallowing sound, the air damp with something that had been waiting too long to break. Amelia crouched near the base of an old cedar, her gloved hands steady as she collected another sample. The soil here was different, richer, rawer, holding traces of something she couldn't explain but could feel. She capped the vial, slipping it into her pack. The wind shifted, threading cool fingers through her hair, lifting the scent of damp earth and pine. And something else. Something wrong. She stilled. The forest had gone quiet. Too quiet. No birds. No rustling branches. Just the deep, empty silence of something watching. Slowly she straightened, scanning the trees. A figure stepped out of the shadows, then another, and another. They didn't move like the pack she had come to know. They weren't fluid, controlled. They were waiting, calculating. A man stepped forward, broad, lean, dressed in dark clothes that made him bleed into the trees. His eyes were sharp, pale, hungry. "Well," he said, voice smooth as riverstone, "look what we have here." Amelia tightened her grip on her bag. "I don't want trouble." A smirk. "Then you walked into the wrong forest." The others circled out, forming a half-moon around her. She measured the distance to the tree line. Too far. She could run, but she wouldn't get far. Could fight, but she wasn't stupid. She straightened her shoulders instead. If they were going to kill her, she'd at least make them work for it. The leader took another step forward. tilting his head. "You don't smell like one of them." She didn't flinch. "Because I'm not," he grinned. "That makes this easier." She exhaled slowly. "Lucian will come for me." The smirk didn't waver. "We're counting on it." Lucian felt it before he heard it. A pull, sharp and sudden. Not a sound, not a scent. Something deeper. Something he couldn't name, only react to. Amelia. He was running before the thought fully formed, the shift already crawling beneath his skin. Rowan was at his side, the others close behind, their movements quiet, lethal. The scent hit him first. Wrong, sharp, foreign, hollow fangs. And Amelia. Too close. His body moved before his mind caught up, instincts taking over. He hit the tree line just in time to see her standing at the center of them, spine straight, chin lifted, defiant. A slow rage built inside him. The leader of the hollow fangs, Dorian, was reaching for her, fingers curling around her wrist. Lucian didn't think. He shifted. It was instant, violent. 1 second he was a man, the next a force of nature. Bone, muscle, fur. His body breaking and reshaping into something primal, something older than language. The hollow fangs barely had time to react before he was on them. His claws found flesh. His teeth met bone. Blood hit the air, sharp and metallic. A snarl tore through the clearing. Then, chaos. The fight was fast, brutal. Amelia had dropped low, out of reach, her pulse hammering in the air. She wasn't screaming. Lucian ripped through the nearest attacker, sending him crashing into the underbrush. He turned in time to see Dorian retreat, his eyes glinting with something that wasn't quite fear. "This isn't over," Dorian called, backing into the shadows. Lucian didn't answer. He stood there, muscles tight, breath heavy, eyes locked on Amelia. She was watching him. Not afraid, not panicked, just watching. The rest of the hollow fangs melted away into the dark. Lucian exhaled, slow and controlled, forcing the shift back, muscle by muscle, bone by bone, until he stood before her human again. His hands were still shaking. Her voice was steady. "You came." His jaw clenched. "I always will." The words had left his mouth before he could stop them, before he could take them back. The clearing was nothing but silver moonlight and moving shadows. The hollow fangs were fast, too fast, slipping through the dark like ghosts with teeth. Snarls cut through the night, low and guttural, followed by the thick sound of bodies colliding, bone meeting bone, claws tearing flesh. Lucian was in the thick of it, his form shifting and twisting between wolf and man, a thing made for war. He hit hard, sent one of them sprawling into the dirt with a snarl that rattled in his chest, but there were too many. And Amelia was still there. She had backed against a fallen tree, her breath sharp and controlled, eyes scanning for an opening. "Think, Amelia, think." One of the hollow fangs broke from the fight, shifting mid-stride. A man 1 second, a massive, hulking wolf the next. His eyes locked on her, hungry. Lucian saw it, felt it. A violent, visceral thing rose inside him, old and undeniable. The wolf in him didn't allow this. Amelia belonged to him. The thought was a mistake, a slip, but it was true. The hollow fang lunged. She reacted without thinking, grabbed the first thing in reach, a vial from her pack. It was supposed to be for samples, but it had something better, a sedative, meant to immobilize large predators. She slammed the needle into his side and pressed the plunger. He howled, staggering back, body twisting between wolf and man as the drug hit his bloodstream. Lucian didn't hesitate. He was there in seconds, finishing what she started. It was fast. Too fast. The hollow fangs knew they had lost. One by one, they fell back into the trees, disappearing into the night. The clearing was silent again, except for the ragged sound of Lucian's breathing. His eyes found hers. She was shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline. "You saved yourself," he said, voice rough. A muscle in her jaw twitched. Wasn't planning on dying today. His chest rose and fell, his body still thrumming with the shift, with the rage that hadn't fully left. He took a step toward her, then another, close enough that she could see the golden edges of his eyes, close enough that he could feel her pulse, too fast, too strong. Something in him settled. She was alive, she was safe, but not because of him, because of her. And he didn't know how to handle that. The cave was tucked deep into the hills, hidden by thick brush and thyme. The air inside was cool, damp, but the fire Rowan built took the bite out of it. Lucian sat near the entrance, one arm resting on his knee, the other bleeding slowly into the dirt. The gash on his side was deep, a Hollowfang's parting gift. Amelia crouched beside him, pressing a damp cloth to the wound. "You're lucky," she muttered, though it was weaker than usual. Didn't feel lucky, she rolled her eyes, but her hands were careful as she worked, dabbing away the blood, inspecting the depth. "You heal fast," she admitted. His gaze flicked to hers. "But you already knew that, didn't you?" She hesitated. Then, before she could stop herself, before she could talk herself out of it, she said it. "I tested our blood." Lucian stiffened. She swallowed. It wasn't normal, any of it. But together? She hesitated, exhaling sharply. "Our DNA. It's like it's responding to each other. She bit her lip. "It's like we're—" "Don't," Lucian said, voice tight. Her eyes snapped to his. "Don't say it," he ground out, jaw clenched. She bristled. "Why? Because you already know it's true?" His muscles tensed, but he didn't move. Because she was right. Because the bond had been there since the moment she walked into his territory. Since the moment he caught her scent in the air. He had spent his whole life knowing that fate was a cruel thing, that it took more than it ever gave, and now it had given him her. A woman who wasn't part of his world. A woman who was too sharp, too stubborn, too dangerous in ways she didn't even realize. He couldn't want this, didn't want this. But when she pressed a fresh cloth to his wound, when her fingers lingered against his skin, his whole body tightened with the need to pull her closer. She wasn't just science, she wasn't just fate, she was his. And that was the problem. The space between them was too small. The firelight flickered, casting shadows across her face. She was close, too close, and for one reckless, stupid second he almost kissed her. But then he pulled back, sharp, sudden, a clean break. Her breath hitched. She didn't move, but something in her eyes hardened. "Right," she murmured, voice cooler now. "Of course." She pulled her hands back, grabbed the cloth, and walked away, leaving him alone in the flickering dark. Lucian exhaled, pressing a hand against his side. The wound hurt, but it was nothing compared to the ache settling in his chest. Chapter 5. Bittersweet Farewell. Amelia hadn't expected warmth. She had expected tolerance, maybe. Resignation at best. The pack wasn't the kind of group to let an outsider walk in and belong. They weren't built that way. But something had changed. The Hollowfangs had tried to take her, and she had fought back. She hadn't run, hadn't screamed, hadn't cowered behind Lucian's protection. She had held her own, and wolves respected survival. She felt it in the way they looked at her now. Less suspicion, more recognition. At the feast, she found herself at the center of it. A low wooden table stretched under the open sky, plates filled with roasted meat, thick bread, rich stews. The pack ate like they fought, with purpose, with energy, as if every meal could be their last. Rowan nudged her plate. "You're not eating," she smirked. "Trying to figure out if this is a test?" He grinned. "You're safe. No one's poisoning the human." A few chuckles from the others. She wasn't sure when she became included in their laughter. An elder raised a small carved bowl, tipping it toward her. Recognition. Another came forward, offering a handful of ash mixed with herbs. A tradition, Rowan had explained. a mark of acceptance. The elder pressed it against her wrist, whispering something she didn't quite understand. She didn't need to. She belonged now, and that scared her more than she wanted to admit. Lucian didn't invite people into his space. The pack had communal buildings, shared rooms, a way of living that blurred the line between personal and shared. But his quarters were his, and yet, here she was. The room was simple, a wide bed, a rough-hewn desk, books stacked in uneven piles. A small fire burned low in the hearth, casting gold light over the wooden walls. Amelia stood in the center, arms crossed, watching him like she was waiting for him to explain something. Maybe he was. "You don't talk about it," she said finally. He didn't pretend not to understand. The mate bond. Lucian exhaled slowly. He wasn't used to explaining things that didn't need explanation. "In the pack," he said, "it's sacred, rare, a connection deeper than instinct." His jaw tightened. "It's binding." She studied him. "That's why you don't want it?" He let out a humorless laugh. "It's not about want." "Then what?" He met her gaze, because lying wasn't an option. "If I let this happen," he said, voice low, "it changes everything." She didn't look away. "It already has." The air between them was too charged, too full. Lucian took a step closer. She didn't move. His fingers brushed against her wrist, where the pack's acceptance mark still lingered. Her pulse jumped under his touch. The pull was there, always there, and for a split second, he almost let himself fall into it. But he couldn't, because once he let her in, there was no way out. So he pulled back. Amelia exhaled, shaking her head slightly like she'd expected it, like she knew he'd do this, but she didn't leave. And that meant more than she realized. She shouldn't have been excited. But as she sat in her makeshift lab, the results flashing across her screen, she felt it. "This could change everything," she murmured. Lucian stood nearby, arms crossed, watching her. Rowan leaned over the table, studying the data. "Explain it to me," Lucian said. She pointed at the display. "Your DNA, your pack's DNA, has markers for regeneration, healing at a rate that shouldn't be possible. If we can isolate the sequences responsible for this, we could potentially apply it to human medicine." Rowan exhaled. "You're talking about curing diseases." She nodded. "Potentially." Lucian's expression didn't change, but she knew what he was thinking. She wasn't just talking about science, she was talking about exposure. "We could do this discreetly," she said, sensing his hesitation. "Strictly controlled, under the radar." His jaw flexed. "That's a fantasy, Amelia. You know what happens when people discover something they don't understand." She swallowed. "This could save lives." He stepped closer, his presence heavy, grounding. "And what about ours?" The question hung between them, bigger than both of them. Amelia had thought she wanted answers. But the deeper she got, the more dangerous the truth became. Dawn came too soon. The sky was a pale, muted gray, the kind of morning that sat heavy with things left unsaid. The pack had gathered near the tree line, their presence quiet but weighted. Some stood with their arms crossed, their expressions unreadable. Others kept their distance, watching her with the kind of wariness that didn't fade overnight. They had accepted her, but acceptance and trust weren't the same thing. Amelia tightened the strap of her bag, fingers curling around the worn leather. She had what she needed: samples, data, proof of everything she had seen, everything she had felt. But it didn't feel like enough, not when she was leaving something behind. She turned, and Lucian was there. He was always there, always watching, always standing just close enough to remind her of what she was walking away from. She swallowed, her throat tight. "I'll be back," she said, softer than she meant to. Lucian didn't answer right away. His dark eyes held hers, steady, searching, like he was trying to find something in them that she wasn't sure she could give. Then, without a word, he reached into his pocket, She barely had time to react before he pressed something into her palm, a small, carved pendant. A wolf, etched in dark wood, smooth from years of handling. She stared at it, feeling the warmth of it in her hand. "Lucian." "It means you're one of us," he said, his voice low, rough. "No matter where you go." Her chest ached. It wasn't a goodbye, it was a claim. She closed her fingers around the pendant. "I'll come back," she said again, like saying it twice made it truer. Lucian exhaled slowly, something unreadable flickering across his face. Then, before she could second-guess herself, before she could let the weight of what she was leaving behind pull her under, she turned and walked away. The city was loud, not just in sound, but in presence. The weight of people. The way everything moved too fast. Neon lights buzzed, car horns blared, conversations overlapped, and the air carried that sharp, artificial tang of exhaust and steel. Amelia stood on the curb outside the research facility, bag slung over her shoulder, Lucian's pendant warm in her palm. It felt wrong. She had spent years here, working, studying, proving herself. This place was supposed to feel like home, but after the forest, after them, after him, it felt like a machine that never stopped running, grinding everything down into numbers and reports. She exhaled and squared her shoulders. Focus. She wasn't here for sentiment. She was here for proof. Inside, the lab hummed with energy, bright, sterile, controlled. Machines hummed, screens blinked with streams of data, and the sharp scent of antiseptic filled the air. Her space was just as she had left it, except now, it felt smaller. She powered up her workstation, the blue glow of the monitor reflecting in her tired eyes. She had work to do. But as she pulled up the data, as she scanned the sequencing, her mind wasn't in the numbers. It was back there, back in the woods, where the air smelled like pine and earth, where the firelight cast long shadows, where Lucian's gaze felt like something she could step into and never come back from. Her fingers brushed the pendant again, and she swallowed hard. She had to finish this. She had to prove they were more than myth. The breakthrough spread faster than she expected. Her colleagues weren't used to hearing excitement in her voice. She was methodical, careful. But this time, she had something big. "This could rewrite genetic therapy," Langley muttered, staring at the data. "The regenerative capabilities alone." "I know," Amelia said. They were gathered in a small conference room, a handful of researchers who didn't dismiss things too quickly, the ones who asked questions instead of shutting doors. "I need more time to analyze it," she continued. "But if this is what I think it is..." A ripple of energy went through the room. She saw a shift. The moment they realized this was real, but not everyone was celebrating. Dr. Warren, one of the senior researchers, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "And have you considered what happens when someone else gets hold of this?" Amelia's pulse ticked up a notch. Langley frowned. "What do you mean?" Warren tapped the table. "You don't sit on something this big without getting attention. Investors, government agencies, pharmaceutical corporations." He paused. "You think they'll just let you publish this and move on?" A cold feeling settled in her stomach. She had been so focused on proving the science, she hadn't thought about what happens after. She had seen what people did to things they didn't understand. And Lucian's world? It wasn't built to survive that kind of exposure. Langley glanced at her. "Amelia, what exactly are we dealing with here?" She hesitated, because she knew, the moment she spoke the truth, everything would change. The conference room smelled like money. Not in the literal sense, but in the way expensive suits and polished wood and high-stakes conversations did. The kind of room where decisions weren't just made, they were bought and sold. Amelia Crow sat at the head of the long glass table, hands folded, expression composed. But beneath it, her pulse beat like a war drum. This was it, the moment where science met consequence. Across from her, the university board members sat in a neat row, Langley among them, leaning forward with the curiosity of a woman who had started to believe the impossible. The others weren't as convinced. Then, there were the investors. They didn't belong here. She knew the moment they walked in. The kind of men who didn't come for knowledge, but for leverage. One of them, a sharp-featured man in a tailored navy suit, glanced at his watch. Bored already? Another, older, heavier, folded his hands and waited. The kind that never spoke first, but always had the final word. She took a breath. Then, she pressed the key on her laptop. The screen behind her lit up, displaying her findings in cold, perfect numbers, sequencing, genetic anomalies. The undeniable proof that what she had found in the forest wasn't just a mutation, it was an evolution. The regenerative properties of this DNA, she began, keeping her voice even, controlled, could change modern medicine. She didn't need to overstate it. The data spoke for itself. Langley sat forward, eyes sharp. You're saying we could… What? Repair degenerative damage? Cure hereditary diseases? Yes, Amelia said. If we can isolate the active sequences. Murmurs. Quick glances. The shift of weight in chairs as the impact hit. And then? The first crack in the room. The man in the navy suit leaned back, tapping his pen against the table. Fascinating, he said, tone smooth as glass. And where exactly did this sample come from? A pause. Here it was. The room wasn't just a room anymore. It was a trap. Amelia kept her expression neutral. The details are classified. A smirk. Come now, Dr. Crow. You don't expect us to invest in an unknown, do you? No. Her fingers curled against the table edge. I expect you to invest in results. More murmurs. Then the heavier man, the one who had been silent until now, spoke. The science is promising, he said. But science is nothing without access. He tilted his head, slow, assessing. We'd need more. Her stomach turned. More. She knew what he meant. Not just data, not just slides and samples, he meant subjects. She glanced at Langley, who looked suddenly uneasy. Then, at Warren, who wasn't looking at her at all. She had walked into this room thinking she could control the conversation. She had been wrong. Conflict escalates. I can't give you that, Amelia said, voice steady. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Then I believe we have a problem. The air in the room thickened. Langley spoke up. We need to consider the ethical implications. The man in navy cut her off with a wave of his hand. Ethics don't cure disease, resources do. He turned back to Amelia. And you, Dr. Crow, have something we want. A cold rush of instinct, a feeling she had only known once before, when she had been surrounded in the woods, watched, except this time, the predators wore suits instead of fangs. Her fingers found the pendant in her pocket. Lucian had given it to her. No matter where you go, she took a breath. I won't compromise my subjects. Another silence, then the heavier man stood. That's unfortunate. Amelia stood too, pulse sharp, tight. You don't understand, she said quietly. Oh, I do. His smile widened. And soon, so will you. She watched as they gathered their files, buttoned their suits, and walked out. Langley turned to her, voice urgent. Amelia, what the hell just happened? She swallowed hard. She had been wrong. The real enemy wasn't out there. It was here. The lab was silent, the kind of silence that comes when something is waiting to break. Amelia Crow sat at her workstation, exhaustion weighing on her, but she ignored it. The data was all that mattered now, what she had built, what she had proven. If she could just… The lights flickered. She frowned, glancing up. Then the screen in front of her glitched. For half a second, her files blinked out. Her gut went tight. She pushed back from her chair, fingers curling against the desk. The whole building was locked. Security was in place. No one should be here. Then she heard it. The faintest scrape of movement in the hallway. Too controlled, too careful. Amelia swallowed. Not a mistake. Someone was inside. She didn't hesitate. She moved, grabbed the drive from her desk, shoved it into her pocket. Her mind was already calculating routes, exits, escape points. Then the glass wall near the door shattered. She hit the floor, arms covering her head as the impact burst through the room. The shards rained down, cutting thin lines against her cheek and arms. Footsteps, coming closer. She pushed herself up, backing toward the equipment storage, where she had a weapon. Then she heard it. A low, guttural growl, not human. Not fully. Lucian. The sound vibrated through the room, deep, primal. The kind of noise that made lesser things run. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, no one moved. Then the shadows shifted. Lucian was there, not fully human, not fully wolf, standing at the shattered entrance, half-shifted and lethal. His breathing was low and measured, his dark eyes locked onto the intruders with a cold promise. They had made a mistake. Amelia's heart slammed against her ribs. Not here, not like this. One of the men, the one closest, saw. His breath caught, something like real fear flickering in his gaze. Lucian moved first. Fast, a blur of strength, sharp edges and raw power. He hit the first man hard, sending him crashing into the metal counter. The second tried to back away. Too late. Lucian grabbed him, pulled him forward, and slammed him against the glass wall so hard it cracked. One left. The man who had seen too much. He reached for something. A weapon, maybe? But Amelia moved before she could think. She grabbed a beaker, the first thing in reach, and smashed it against his temple. He hit the floor, unconscious. For a long, heavy moment, no one spoke. Lucian was still half-shifted, breathing hard, and Amelia, she stood there, her own breath sharp, her choice staring her in the face. Expose him and protect him with logic, or cover for him and put them both in danger, she exhaled. Then she looked up at the security cameras and deleted the footage. Lucian didn't move, but something in his eyes shifted, like he understood exactly what she had just done, like it changed everything. They didn't get far before the next trap sprung. Rowan was waiting outside, tension in his stance, his jaw tight. "We've got a problem." No time to ask, no time to think. The men from the meeting were here, not in suits now, not pretending to negotiate. Amelia saw it immediately, the hard lines of their expressions, the way they stood, blocking the exits. This wasn't a conversation, it was a deal made in advance. Warren was among them. Of course he was. "Dr. Crow," he said, voice too smooth, too knowing. That was quite the display. Lucian wasn't breathing. Not in the normal way. He was calculating. Rowan stepped closer, subtly blocking Amelia's side. "We know what you have," Warren continued, unfazed. "We know what you're hiding." His eyes flicked to Lucian. "And we know what he is." The weight of it settled. Lucian's muscles coiled. He didn't move. Yet. But he was waiting. For a reason. For a threat. For an excuse. Amelia squared her shoulders. "I don't know what you think you saw," she said, voice sharper now. "But you're wrong." Warren's mouth twitched. "Am I?" She kept her face blank, controlled, because the only way out of this was forward. "You have nothing," she said simply. "No proof. No case." She took a step forward, closing the gap instead of widening it. "What you have is a problem, because if I go public, if I say you tried to steal my research, to coerce me into turning over confidential genetic findings?" She smiled, sharp and slow. "Tell me how that looks for your investors." A flicker of hesitation, just a flicker. Lucian took that exact second to step forward, all alpha, all control. His presence suffocated the space. "If you come near her again," he said, voice low, controlled, lethal, "I will end you." No growl, no shift, no need, because it wasn't a threat. It was fact. The men exchanged glances, calculating. They weren't fighters. They were businessmen. and businessmen only played when they had leverage. Tonight, they didn't. Warren exhaled, controlled again. "We'll be in touch." Then they were gone. But it wasn't over. Amelia knew it. Lucian knew it. They had won this round, but the war was coming, and the only way they survived? Together. The boardroom smelled like power, the kind that sat in mahogany desks and dictated the world in quiet, measured tones. Amelia Crow sat at the table, her hands folded, her expression smooth, not giving them anything. Across from her, the university officials sat in stiff-backed chairs, eyes sharp, waiting. The investors weren't here this time. They had been removed from the conversation because they had lost. Langley sat to her left, a quiet presence but a supportive one. She had helped arrange this meeting, helped ensure the narrative wasn't controlled by the wrong hands. Warren wasn't smiling now. He hadn't since the night in the lab. His fingers tapped once against the table before he spoke. "The findings you submitted," he said, "are extraordinary." He meant dangerous. Amelia didn't blink. Valentina Langley cleared her throat. "The ethical guidelines are clear. If this research moves forward, it will be under strict oversight. No unauthorized testing, no exposure." Silence. Then another official, a man with gray at his temples and an expression that had seen too many bad deals, spoke. "And the subjects?" The word made Amelia's blood run cold. She exhaled slowly. "That's not an option." More silence. Then Warren leaned forward, voice too smooth, too knowing. "Dr. Crow, you're asking us to believe in something you won't even prove exists." She met his gaze, steady, unshakable. "I'm asking you to respect the boundaries of science and ethics." A pause. A beat. "Unless that's not something this institution values?" A shift in the room, the kind that meant the tide was turning. She had them. Warren knew it. The man with the gray temples exhaled through his nose. "No exposure," he said finally. "Controlled research only." It was a victory. A fragile peace, but peace nonetheless. And Amelia? She had protected them. She had protected him. And she had done it on her terms. The enclave was alive with firelight. The pack had gathered beneath the open sky, the moon sitting heavy above them, watching. It felt different this time, because this time she wasn't just visiting. Lucian stood beside her, his presence grounding, a force she had stopped fighting the moment she realized he had always been inevitable. Rowan smirked from the sidelines. "Didn't think you'd actually come back." Amelia rolled her eyes. "Then you don't know me very well." A few chuckles from the others, but there was something else in the air. Recognition. Lucian stepped forward, the pack quieted. He looked at her, and the whole world narrowed. "This is more than acceptance," he said. His voice was low, steady, certain. "You stand with us now." A beat, a pause, then Rowan moved forward holding something small. A blade, silver but not deadly. Lucian took it, his gaze never leaving hers. And she understood. This wasn't just a ritual. It was a vow. She inhaled, slow and measured. Then, without hesitation, she offered her palm. Lucian made the cut. Small, clean, a mark not of pain, but of belonging. A single drop of blood met his, and the pack howled. The sound wrapped around them, raw and ancient, the kind of thing that didn't belong to the world outside these woods. And Amelia? She didn't belong to that world anymore either. She belonged here, with him. The fire had burned low, the embers glowing in the night like the last heartbeat of something ancient. The pack had begun to drift, voices fading into the hush of the forest. But Lucian and Amelia stayed. Steadily, she stood just beyond the edge of the clearing, the night air cool against her skin, the sky endless above them. Lucian was beside her, quiet, watching her the way he always did. Like she was something he wasn't sure he was allowed to have, but couldn't walk away from. I still don't know how this works, she murmured, turning the carved pendant between her fingers. I don't know how to be part of this world. Lucian exhaled slowly. Then we make it work, together. She looked at him, something flickering in her chest. Because that was it, wasn't it? Not fate, not the science, just this. Him. Her. The space in between. She stepped closer. You were right, you know, about what happens when people find something they don't understand. His gaze didn't waver. And yet, you're still here. A small smile ghosted across her lips. I think I was always meant to be. Lucian reached for her then, no hesitation this time. His fingers curled around the nape of her neck, his body warm and solid against hers. And when he kissed her, it was a promise. Not just a claiming, not just the bond pulling them together, but a choice. Her fingers dug into his shoulders, his breath sharp against her skin. The world outside the enclave, the city, the science, the threats waiting beyond the trees, none of it mattered in this moment, because they had found something real. And neither of them were going to let it go. The stars stretched above them, the moon a silent witness. Amelia leaned into Lucian, their fingers loosely laced. We could build something here, she said, half thinking aloud. A research facility, nothing big, just enough to do the work without putting anyone at risk. Lucian tilted his head. You trust humans with that? Not all of them, she smirked. But I trust me. His lips quirked, just a little. She exhaled. There's a way to do this right. I know there is. We don't have to hide everything. Lucian was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. A small concession. A beginning. Start small, he said. People you trust. She smiled. That's the plan. Lucian pulled her against him, pressing his lips to her temple. Then we'll figure it out. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and rain. The world felt open now, like it had just started. Amelia and Lucian stood at the forest's edge, looking out into the unknown. She reached for him. He took her hand, and behind them, the first howl of the night rose into the sky. It wasn't an ending. It was a beginning.